Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and sometimes in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. For today's episode, I was lucky enough to be joined by three guests. They were Derek Armitage from the University of Waterloo, Jennifer Silver from the University of Guelph, and Dan Akamoto from Florida State University. They joined me to chat about natural resource management, and in particular, how governance can be integrated with qualitative measures and methods. I'll let them describe, so let's go straight to our conversation. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Yeah, wonderful to be here.
Okay, so as we get started, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the way that populations are managed, in particular fish. What does that mechanism look like? How do we know, how a given fishery is doing? How do we know how many fish there are in the stock?
So that's actually a really complicated question, in part because the way in which fisheries are managed around the world, even within Canada, United States, Australia, within those different nations, there's a wide array of rules and regulations and methods for assessing how many fish there are and the sustainability of those stocks. But generally, in a situation where you've got a lot of capacity, there's generally an application of fairly complex quantitative tools to measure how many fish there are.
And I think one of the challenges in managing fisheries is that often we have lots of competing objectives. There might be obviously some ecological objectives, but also economic objectives. And increasingly, when we're managing fisheries, there's an emphasis on trying to understand a bit more clearly what some of the social objectives are for those fisheries. How do they relate to people's well-being, their cultural well-being, issues like that. So it gets increasingly complicated as we reflect on the changes that are taking place in a lot of fisheries around the world and how we're going to grapple with those changes in a decision-making context.
And I guess the other thing I would say too is that on top of the sort of technical approaches and details, there's the element of sort of politics, and that can play into decision making. There is usually, as Dan was talking about, scientific advice given, and then there are managers and or politicians even who at the end of the day sometimes are making decisions about allocation and that kind of thing.
Okay, and one of the things you touch on in the article as well is the role of compliance in the management of fisheries and so on. How does that play a role?
Well, compliance is a tricky issue because it has obviously a technical component to it, but plays a role in the sense that we don't always understand what is shaping compliance. So there may be a rational decision among people to say, obviously we need to comply with a rule about a fishery and things like that. But the reasons behind why people comply with a particular rule can vary widely. It can be an economic rationale, but can also be, as we talked about before, some sort of a social component to it as well. And it's very difficult to necessarily get this understanding of compliance into our decision-making processes as effectively as we might like.
And in some ways, that's there are technical challenges and management challenges associated with thinking about compliance. So you may implement what's called a no-take reserve or a marine protected area, and if you have no individuals there to monitor and enforce the regulations, it's pretty easy to assume that you may have a pretty low compliance rate in kind of obeying by those rules. At the same time, there's a bunch of fisheries, for example, in Alaska, where individual fisheries may be managed on a very small, like this can happen over a very short period of time, and it's often difficult for the manager. It's a very tough task for the managers to actually open the fishery and close it right when they think they've got enough fish. Right, so monitoring that is a huge technical challenge. That you may have compliance that's intentional on the part of the fishermen, or a lack of compliance, but you may also have a lack of compliance in part just because of the difficulty in kind of the feedback between how many fish are being caught and how many fish are supposed to be caught. So there may be incidental versus intentional compliance as well.
But I think one of the reasons we were drawn to compliance as a kind of proxy in this particular paper is that, first of all, that it is oftentimes, kind of in our opinion anyway, that that there are the way in which the social, quote unquote, the social was incorporated into modeling and decision making had largely to do with economic considerations. And so what compliance allows us to think about is sort of different ways in which fishers, reasons why and ways in which fishers might be responding to rules in a fishery. So I think that I suppose that in the paper we don't sort of name a specific way in which there was compliance or not, but just kind of in naming it, it allows us to think in a more complex way about human behavior within the system.
Yeah, and so I agree completely. And I think how we were really trying to make use of compliance, because it is such a tricky concept, though, is that it's very much a surrogate for those things that influence decision making and how people respond to decision making. And so, if people feel that the rules that they have to comply with are not legitimate, that they weren't involved in making those rules, that they didn't participate in those rules, that those rules that they're complying with aren't flexible, that their own knowledge about the stocks and about the environmental changes taking place aren't reflected in those rules, then they're far less likely to comply over time. And so that's what we were trying to do in this paper, is find a way to use something that's a little bit more tractable, like compliance, as a surrogate for these really messy and difficult things to understand that shape how we manage a fishery.
And then I guess in addition to compliance, another part of it has to be the way in which the system responds to feedback. So, the various bits of information it gets about the health of current stocks and the numbers. How are fisheries and other resource management systems able and successful or unsuccessful in dealing with that kind of information as it becomes available?
Yeah, okay. So I would say there's a strong interest in this notion of evidence-based decision-making in these contexts, but all our fishery systems are really characterized by a great deal of complexity and uncertainty because of environmental changes, because of changes in stocks, because of changes in how people are using the fishery. And so it is very difficult for our institutions of governance to respond to these feedbacks, but it is crucial that we do so, especially in the herring fishery that we're using in this paper as sort of an exemplar. All we have to do is look at what happened with the stock collapse of cod in the east coast of North America and Canada in particular. And as a classic example of where the feedbacks were not brought into the decision-making context in a quick enough time, and the consequences for people and the stocks were obviously very severe.
I would add to that as I think Derek has started to hint at, that some of that is just about the design of the system, of the institutional, of the governance system. So in the context of evidence-based decision in fisheries in Canada, for example, there are a relatively narrow set of criteria and indicators that are formally part of the system to consider, right? So sometimes there is, the feedback in which might be providing the best insight into the rapid change or decline is not part of the formal evaluation of the fishery. And so I guess it's another way to think about or a way to make the argument as to why institutional design and governance is a really important consideration in fisheries.
Mm-hmm. And one thing to consider there is it's really difficult to measure compliance, right? It's often the ocean is a complex and pretty vast area. And having not a sufficient number of eyes on the water to monitor those kinds of the processes that might give rise to people taking more or and extracting in a different way than they're expected to is a really difficult thing to measure. And what happens is that over time you think you have a certain amount of clients, and a few years later you have a statistical model that tells you actually you've had quite a bit more. But at that point, that extra amount of non-compliance has been going on for some time, and the effects are kind of exacerbated. And so having institutional structures, governance structures, that can be either deal with, ameliorate, or be robust to those kinds of uncertainties is something that can kind of absorb all those uncertainties that from a scientific standpoint are difficult to deal with.
I guess I would just add, if I can as well, that when we're thinking about the way we design institutions and our governance processes, well, there's unfortunately no clear blueprint for success, right? So lots of different governance arrangements and institutional designs may yield different social and ecological outcomes depending on the context. And so again, as Jen mentioned, this is why we're really in this paper trying to reflect more critically on what these broader governance processes and arrangements are that reflect ultimately how we make specific decisions about a fishery, knowing that there is no clear roadmap or blueprint that's available for us to help us with that process.
Okay, and I wonder then, what might we be doing differently, or what might managers be doing differently if they were trying to create a model that was, more resilient to various perturbations, or in particular, capable of incorporating the changing data as it came in from various sources.
So one of the things, I guess to back up a little bit, one of the way in which a lot of fisheries and a lot of expertise is we use something what's called management strategy evaluation. That's kind of the gold standard from an analytical standpoint for trying to understand the consequences of particular management scenarios. And what that involves is we build a model of how we think the fish populations work, and build into that a little model of how we think the fishery works, and we build into that a model of how we think the science and the managers work. And those are we use computer systems to kind of evaluate this whole process and see what different outcomes are, kind of like financial forecasting or weather forecasting. It's full of uncertainties, and one of the things that we've tried to do in this paper is try to think about how to integrate different ways in which at a higher level governance structures may interact with those processes. In part, if there's, for example, a politician has some additional leeway in terms of thinking about overriding individual management recommendations, those kind of things, in building in our understanding about how the government systems work, not just the management, the fisheries, and the science, can be quite useful in terms of thinking about those. And now the challenge is, how do we actually characterize how governance systems work? That's quite a tricky thing.
And that's where, so in kind of thinking about how to integrate governance and social considerations into MSE, we turn to literature and social science, political science institutions in particular. And in the paper, there are several of these governance attributes identified. And so these come from social science literature and research on institutional design, and kind of informed how we thought about so we use the term governance context in the paper to kind of try and capture the setting or the situation in which these models are being applied and decisions are being made based on them. And so that governance context could be characterized by these different attributes that we raise in the paper. So for example, efficiency, flexibility, is there the degree to which there's knowledge co-production going on? And so that's the way we started to try and tackle this essentially this integration or contextualization of MSE with the larger governance context.
Yes, so there's in my view, there's kind of these really challenging but really fun technical dimensions of this problem that we're grappling with. But what we also tried to do in the paper is kind of raise up, sort of provide a little higher level thinking as well, and say, if managers are going to be grappling with some of this complexity and these feedbacks and all this kind of stuff a bit more effectively through time, we need to be thinking about some of these models, obviously technical new ways, but also reflecting on the fact that these models and the process that's involved in creating them very much about co-production, of a co-production process that we can get more people engaged in this. We can get more stakeholders engaged in these types of things. They become a bit of a boundary object for more discussion. And when we do that, that's going to raise issues of people's values or their perceptions about what's happening. And those kind of things become really important context for the decisions that are being made. And I suppose part of that is also the need to be thinking about these models as reflecting very tightly connected social and ecological systems. It's not just an ecological system we're trying to model or just a social system, but a linked social and ecological system, which adds to the complexity and the puzzles that we're dealing with.
Yeah, one of the challenges I think on that front is as ecologists and biologists that deal with kind of building models of how we think populations work. We will spend a lot of time, we understanding these the kind of nuances of the ecology of the management systems. But the expertise in governance is really something that's far afield. And one of the things I think we learned in this exercise in doing this study was just even getting on the same page in terms of jargon and language and of how we think about problems, even though we're working in the same space, is quite a challenge. In part just because of the massive differences in backgrounds and these kinds of transdisciplinary approaches. There's quite a learning curve associated with it, and so that this field of MSE that's integrating more nuanced social and kind of governance structures is kind of a frontier in that way.
Yeah, it sounds like something that requires a more of an interdisciplinary approach than you might have been traditionally envisioned for this type of management.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just concur with what Dan has said. Is that a lot of the work of this paper at the front end of it was really getting on the same page with language and terminology. Derek and I, as the social scientists involved in kind of leading it, had to learn a lot about MSE and try and wrap our heads around that and think about the ways in which some of the governance attributes that I was just talking about might be put into conversation or work with thinking around how MSE works or should work in decision making. So yeah, the interdisciplinarity was and is key, and I think will continue to be as this field develops. And I also just wanted to give a shout out to the Ocean Modeling Forum, which really was the impetus for us all coming together, and a much larger group than just the three of us, I should add, coming together around basically thinking about how human dimensions and social dimensions could be incorporated and addressed through a quantitative modeling approach. And so it really was 2 years or so where we met over a period of 2 or 3 years. We met in person 4 times as a large group. And there have been various papers that have come out of the work that the listeners might want to take a look at to give a broader sense for what we've been up to. But that really, that in-person time and thinking and talking together was really invaluable, and even beginning to decide what we might tackle through the papers themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the first times we met as a group, we spent several hours using words like management and governance, and it took us a while to realize we actually aren't saying the same thing in the room. I mean, when I say management, I have something in mind, and when some of our colleagues say management, they had something quite different in mind. And for us, coming at this, all from, as Dan and Jen have mentioned, from very different backgrounds. We have anthropologists and biologists and modelers, and we have First Nations representatives and industry people. We're all using very different language, and so it takes these kind of processes that we're engaged in to trying to lead to outcomes like this take a long time to develop and to format. And you really did some of those intangible things about building trust among our group and getting along with each other that really are important for outcomes like this in this interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary space.
And just to follow up on that, one of the keys to a successful management strategy evaluation program is, from the beginning, the direct involvement of stakeholders and title holders and managers and folks that are making decisions, but also some of the politicians, in order to understand the degree to which individual scenarios that are being simulated in these computer models are either feasible, realistic, represent the true objectives of what those individuals have, and how they be at odds for different parties. For example, one of the objectives here was to evaluate under what scenarios do you get really different outcomes than you might expect if you were just using a classic MSE process. And especially integrating some of the objectives of our First Nations partners and the managers at the same time, or at least the stock assessors, can give you quite a different answer than if you had just kind of built your simulation models in a vacuum outside of the direct involvement with some transparency on the end of those who are kind of constructing these processes.
Okay, and I guess that raises the question then of, what should managers do differently? Obviously there's as you described, there's the temptation or the standard practice of taking a model and simply applying limits or management objectives on that basis. But what should they be doing differently to incorporate the viewpoints of the various stakeholders and potentially improve outcomes?
I guess one of the things that I guess our argument in this paper is that there being a lot of good things already. I think we want to make that clear. I mean, there's lots of great examples out there of people and researchers and managers working collaboratively to try and figure these things out. One of our arguments, I guess, and we tried to capture this in a little bit of a figure as well, is that at the different stages of these processes of the MSE and things like that, there is room for thinking a little bit more broadly about who's involved in these types of processes. To what extent are different voices and values and perspectives being heard, and are individuals from different backgrounds participating? To what extent are different types and sources of knowledge being included in these evaluations as well? I mean, Jen mentioned one of there's different papers and outcomes, but one of the really interesting outcomes of the Ocean Modeling Forum was this idea that younger herring are going to follow older herring back to spawning sites and things like that, and there's different lines of evidence about this. One was coming from fishery scientists, and one was coming from some of our Indigenous partners that also observe these kinds of things. And so, the opportunity here was for these different knowledge systems to come together in the context of a decision-making process and management evaluation process like this. And so, this is really is key to pushing us forward, is to make sure that more people are involved, more insights are being included in these models, and that they are a source for broader discussions about these multiple objectives that are associated with any fishery.
On that note, one of the things that I think is really valuable, just the process of involving title holders and stakeholders in the process, at least especially from the very beginning, is that if those processes lead to outcomes that are integrated directly into management, that process can be seen as more legitimate because it was directly generated from kind of a more inclusive process rather than one that excluded individual stakeholders or where they felt they didn't have an individual voice.
Yeah, and I would just add to the question of how might we be thinking about fisheries management differently, or how might it evolve into the future. My answer to this goes a bit beyond the scope of this particular paper, but I think there's a lot of really interesting work being done around questions of like the social objectives of fisheries, questions around if harvesters are from small coastal places and increasingly the access rights, licenses and quota are consolidating outside of those communities. What does that mean for the economic future of smaller communities? And should fisheries be managed in a way to try to support economic sustainability and resilience in smaller communities, and to what extent? So there are ways in which, and interesting conversations happening around sort of the social and economic objectives of fisheries, and the ways in which fisheries evaluation might better reflect, if there is indeed a broad desire to have fisheries managed in different ways for different types of objectives, and then how can you have fisheries evaluation sort of reflect those diverse objectives. So I think that again, a bit beyond the scope of this paper, though not unrelated, and I think it's a really important and interesting question that fisheries researchers are grappling with at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, in addition to that, the ability, So the ability to characterize the degree to which there is how the government structure works into a computer model is a challenge in itself. So in the herring fishery, for example, a few years ago, there was a scenario where the scientists recommended there would be a closure based upon agreed upon historical rules. And those rules were simulation tested in something akin to a management strategy evaluation framework and that was seen as sustainable. And the recommendation was the fishery should not be prosecuted, and yet there was the latitude in the minister to be able to open that fishery regardless of those recommendations. Right? And that leeway for the minister to be able to do that is something that wasn't necessarily built into the original simulation framework that evaluated that this certain management strategy is sustainable and adequate. So being able to characterize the structure of how decisions are made is a really important aspect of ensuring that you're kind of capturing the nature of the system adequately.
And Dan, that's why we also, in addition to compliance, took up inertia, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So in this case, we were looking at inertia, which is this idea that if you've got a fishery that looks like it's doing fine, and all of a sudden it starts to take a nosedive, there's an economic incentive in some ways to buffer fishermen or fishers against declining catches, right? So one might, instead of just closing the fishery pretty drastically, ramp down fishing in order to protect the fishers and the economic system against that kind of dramatic disturbance. And in our sense, that in our analysis, that turned out to have counterintuitive outcomes where it actually made the system worse.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's one of the bigger messages from the paper that we were our group was trying to convey, is that even the most proficient models, are going to be full of these potential breakpoints, if you will, that are caused by that broader governance system or governance context. And so, whether it might be as Dan mentioned, a ministerial decision that comes about rather surprisingly, or some sort of land claim or resource claim or something like that. These are a whole series of governance processes that can create a breakpoint in that management process and that management decision-making system. And so we're really trying to figure out how to get that incorporated into these management processes, these MSCs more effectively, and these quantitative approaches more effectively. And so we're using compliance and inertia as our entry point in that. We still, I think, and that's why we're pretty excited about this kind of stuff, is we have lots of questions a long way to go before we really figure this stuff out. And so we're looking forward to grappling with this puzzle a little bit longer.
And I guess that raises a question for me, how do you do that? How do you work something like that into a model, a possibility that some management action will take place that's, far outside the expectations of, what you would normally have? Is there a coherent way to work that in? Do you model in a certain percentage chance that X will happen if Y will happen, or is this more you place an asterisk and expect that human beings will in running the models kind of hold out a possibility that something unexpected will occur?
Well, so that's in the way we do management strategy evaluation. For if we think, or just taking a step back for a second, thinking about the populations, we don't know what's going to happen with a fish population. Some of these are incredibly dynamic. They're highly complex. There's all sorts of uncertainties about how, for example, extreme events like El Niños and various things might create, perturbations in those populations. And you get the same, challenge with thinking about, building models of governance. Now, one of the things done over the last, many years is fishery scientists have got quite good at modeling fish populations. I think one of the things that is a little bit more of a frontier is how do you model a government? How do you model governance? How do you model managers? And that's a little bit of a challenge, and it requires integration with people who study behavior, who study incentive structures and what that causes people to do. and also an analysis of the structure of the system. So in some cases, like certain fisheries in the United States, there's not leeway to go beyond what's in the recommendations. That's basically given by law. That if there's particular recommendations that go through the science panels, the fisheries are essentially bound by having some conservative limits on how much they harvest. Now, in other cases, you may not have those. And so in those cases, you may actually do some analysis of what happens in the worst case scenario, what happens in the best case scenario. And that where it requires kind of an integration of people who understand how those systems work, as well as some creativity on the side of modelers to both simulate different potential outcomes, as well as be quite good and clear about conveying what that means to the managers and the fishery for what the kind of consequences could be, and why one might want to be conservative if there's room for going a little bit overboard on the fishery.
I would just add, in this whole process of us trying to think through these things, there's definitely a philosophical challenge that we're confronting, right? So, trying to parameterize governance is something that a lot of social scientists would be very uncomfortable with. Context really matters. Context is key in all this stuff. For those of us from a social science background, we're very obviously thinking about those contextual conditions that are crucial. So, we're trying to take ourselves a little bit into this zone of discomfort as to how do we actually take some of these ideas that we have disciplinary training in, and take them into this space where we may have to do things that we wouldn't necessarily be comfortable doing. It's not a straightforward approach to this, but we do, as you mentioned, James, put an asterisk on a lot of this stuff, recognizing that we're trying to do something a little bit different. I don't know, Jen, if you feel the same way, but I feel like we have to deal with these philosophical challenges in this process a fair bit.
Yeah. I would agree that the idea that we could sufficiently capture the social complexity within the system in a model is one that, myself included, I would say there are certainly limits to that, and limits to given the hard work that it takes to do that and do it well. At what point would it, what's the cost benefit trade-off of doing that? There's certainly questions around that too. I think, again, to reiterate the value in this, one big value I see in this particular group that's come together, it is to get us to start talking some of the same language, or at least to understand better where each other is coming from. And one thing that I really do think reads through in the paper is we did a decent job of sort of saying we picked compliance and inertia. These are not the only ones. These ones are ones that we thought could connect or connect well to the governance attributes, so it made sense in the context of the particular MSC we were thinking about, or the example we were thinking about. So I think the value is that we got on the same page with a lot of that, and also in the paper sort of say that the models don't operate in isolation of the larger system, and I think that in and of itself as a message to fisheries scientists and managers and decision makers is a really important one. I think a lot of them know that, although it may be not at the forefront of their minds when they're doing the really complex and technical work that they are. But that again, that point that the models don't operate in isolation from the system, social and ecological system in which they're working, is a really important point. Although maybe it sounds simple, but I think it is really crucial.
Okay, and then I guess I'll ask, finally, what's next for this work? This may be through the Ocean Modeling Forum or through some other body or just individual work. Feel free to answer however you'd like. But what's next for this field, and what should we be looking out for in the future?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think in the paper we kind of point to some directions that we want to try and continue to push this kind of work. There's we mentioned the fact that there's really no single pathway to try and figure out how governance influences quantitative evaluations, whether it's in fisheries or forestry or some sort of conservation context. So for me anyway, one of the things that I want to do is continue to pick up on this effort to think about governance in these contexts and engage in more collaborations like we have in the Ocean Modeling Forum, and just to pursue some of these ideas, test them in different places, see how they're working in different management strategy evaluation contexts. I think we can learn a lot from comparing different experiences. I mean, MSC is being used in lots of different places. Some of them are very participatory and engaging with lots of different stakeholders and partners. And so it's looking at those, seeing how they're grappling with these kinds of broader governance challenges and contexts, and learning lessons from those experiences, and then thinking how we can advance the overall process of resource management more effectively.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I think one of the things that is incredibly important, especially this day and age where we've got quite a bit of political volatility and a lot of swings between governments that can be quite pro versus a little bit antagonistic towards more sustainable practices, is the direct integration of both stakeholders, but also folks like Derek and Jen, who study governance from the beginning of the process, rather than integrating folks kind of midway through, where we've got some either quantitative tools or particular objectives, and then injecting those into the process kind of ad hoc or later on. These kind of partnerships, when they develop from both first principles at the outset of those meetings, can give quite different structures and different objectives and different outcomes, depending on kind of who's structuring those and how much time is required for individuals to get on a synergistic path.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've just, as we've been talking, I've been wondering about the ways in which you could kind of do comparative work. We were thinking of one example, but could you compare different fisheries in different places, in different contexts, and see how playing with inertia and compliance or other sort of governance proxies would change outcomes? So I think that there's probably something to be gained, lots to be gained through maybe comparative examples rather than single examples. One thing that has struck me as I've learned through the Ocean Modeling Forum process is the scale at which a lot of fisheries modeling is done. And this came materialized in a lot of our conversations where we had Indigenous rights holders and partners in the room, and the scale at which those community level and Indigenous knowledge observations happen is at a much smaller scale than a lot of the modeling happens, of course. And so there are questions, I think, around the scale at which modeling and observations happen, and the scale at which decisions, sometimes decisions for the entire coastline, or at least large parts of coastlines, are taken. And so I'm not quite sure how to articulate it better at this stage than just to say I think that there are questions around the scale at which observations, models, and decisions all are happening, and whether that there be possibility to play with that and learn from that.
And I think that's a great point to leave it on. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, James.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.